Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Hello and welcome to Utopian Horizons, a podcast where I cover a different utopia, dystopia, utopian thinker or movement in each episode. This particular episode is about a video game called Snatcher. I won't go into too much detail about what that is now, but for those of you who don't know, when I get into the conversation with my guest, we'll go into a bit of background and describe what the game is. But just to say, it's basically a kind of detective game set in a cyberpunk dystopia, and it's made or designed by Hideo Kojima, who's most famous for the Metal Gear Solid series. It came out, I think, in the late 80s in Japan, but over in Europe and America, it came out in the mid-90s. Joining me to talk about the game is Trevor Strunk. He is an academic, but he also has a video game podcast called No Cartridge. And again, we'll talk about that when I get into my conversation with him. But just to say that that's definitely worth checking out if you're into video games. Briefly, I just want to say again, thank you for those of you who support me on Patreon. I've been rolling out some bonus episodes on Utopia and music, a video game called Not Tonight, and Cowboy Bebop. And yeah, a few people have come back to me to say they've been enjoying about the stuff. So yeah, that's cool to hear. And if you want to hear any of that stuff, then if you go to patreon.com/Utopian Horizons, then you can sign up and get access to those extra episodes and the ones that are to come. I also wanted to say I noticed a couple of new reviews on iTunes as well. So thank you very much to those of you that gave me those. That's also helpful for those of you who don't want to or can't afford to support me on the Patreon. iTunes reviews or whatever, it's called like Apple Podcasts, isn't it? And I always call it iTunes, but regardless, those reviews are really helpful. So and just very nice and motivating to read when people say nice stuff about the podcast. Yeah, thank you for those. And if any of you haven't reviewed the podcast yet and are enjoying it, that would be cool. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there and keep this intro relatively short this time. I'm sure people are fed up of me going on about the Patreon and iTunes reviews. So yeah, I will leave you now with my conversation with Trevor on Snatcher. Oh, one other thing, we do talk a bit about kind of current events, but this was recorded a few weeks ago, so I think everything that we talk about is still very relevant, but it's just things might have progressed a bit since then. So if you're wondering why it seems like we're a little bit behind, it's because we spoke a few weeks ago. So yeah, here is me and Trevor from the past talking about a video game. Joining me now is Trevor Strunk. He has a podcast called No Cartridge Audio and a website called No Cartridge. Thank you very much for joining me, Trevor.
Of course, absolutely, my pleasure.
Before we get started, would you like to explain to people what No Cartridge is? They perhaps might be interested in it.
Yeah. So No Cartridge is a podcast that I put out weekly. Generally, I would say like 90% of the time it's me talking with one or more people just about video games that they like and tapping into some element of it that's a little deeper, I guess, either the aesthetic or the political or the social, something you wouldn't necessarily hear about or think about just casually when thinking about video games. So, I've had it described as like philosophy in video games or literary criticism in video games, but it's a little less heady than that, I would say. It's a little bit like the Fresh Air podcast, if all it was talking to people about the video games they played or made.
Okay. Do you have like an academic background there? You do, don't you?
I do, yeah. I have a PhD in English, so and I hesitate to call it my day job because arguably the podcast is probably as much time, if also now as much earning potential. But the my day job is an adjunct professor at a college nearby. So I teach English here and there, but mostly, yeah, English background.
Cool. Okay. Well, Trevor has come on to the podcast today to talk about Snatcher. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a video game that was released in 1988 originally in Japan. It's been released on a number of different platforms, but in the West, most people will be familiar with it through its release on the Sega CD in 1994. And it's a cyberpunk detective game where you play as a guy called Gillian Seed, who is a junker who has lost his memories. And the job of a junker is to search for snatchers who have taken the place of real people. So kind of like, we'll describe more of that a bit later on, but kind of like androidy things that take over the place of people. So he's basically Deckard from Blade Runner, right?
It's very Blade Runner, absolutely. I mean, even down to the gun, right? Like it's almost self-consciously Blade Runner-y.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So this is set up as like an investigation, kind of like a visual novel / point and click investigation kind of thing. So you're like talking to people, searching for clues, trying to uncover of the mystery. That's basically how the game progresses, and it's very of its time in many ways, but I think surprisingly relevant to some stuff that's happening today, as we'll get onto. So this game is kind of obscure because, as I said, it came out on the Sega CD in Europe and the US, which was pretty much a failure as a console. Didn't sell particularly well, so it's kind of an obscure game.
I had one.
You had one?
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, I didn't have Snatcher, but I had a Sega CD. Yeah.
Okay, that's rare.
We bought one. Yeah, we bought one because we thought it was going to be like a super successful system, and it wasn't. But I definitely enjoyed playing Sonic CD and Sewer Shark and stuff. I mean, it's just like that whole FMV time was really was kind of like just a bust.
So you knew that CDs were the future already, but you just hadn't.
Yeah,
you picked the wrong.
I picked the wrong horse. Well, it was one of those things where when my folks got divorced, they were still friendly, but like I had my Super Nintendo at my mom's, and then I got a Sega at my dad's, and I'm pretty sure I have got the Sega because he got it because he kind of like would play it at night or whatever.
Okay.
But we got a Sega CD on that, and because he saw it and he was like, "Yep, you know what? Let's do it." It was like a splurge for him, and it turned out to just be like a terrible, terrible choice.
Yeah, sure. Right. So, I mean, part of the reason this game still has a strong reputation, despite being obscure because of that failed console, I think it's probably because it was directed, I think, and written by Hideo Kojima.
Yeah.
For people who don't know games particularly well, I get the feeling that a lot of people that listen to my podcast do know games, but there's probably people who don't as well. So could you explain a bit for people about who Hideo Kojima is and why would that kind of give this game like a status that would keep it relevant?
Yeah, sure. So Hideo Kojima is probably the best known video game auteur. Like, if, in film, is there sort of like an auteur theory that gives us people like, I don't know, like Fellini or Fellini's a good example. But video game auteurism sort of runs the same basic theoretical gamut where you have creators that sell products based on just their being attached to it, even though, especially in video games, their actual what they actually do as head of a project is much more obscure. So Kojima is interesting too because he's not like Shigeru Miyamoto is the Nintendo version of this, who sort of like is related to Mario and Zelda and all the various Nintendo people. Kojima is just associated with one series in particular, which is Metal Gear and Metal Gear Solid. And he is sort of like, I think like if you were to name the most famous protagonist of Metal Gear Solid, you'd probably say Solid Snake, who's the main sort of special ops character in it. And then you'd say Kojima. Because the sort of like political fantasia of the piece and like the ways that it's kind of about contemporary politics and contemporary ideas, that is so like caught up in his persona at this point that, I mean, I don't know if it was when he created Snatcher. Snatcher seems like weirdly more playful and open to being different than that, than Kojima of the present. Definitely. But he is very much a locked in kind of guy that way.
Yeah. You very much you're very kind of aware of the fact that you're playing a Kojima game a lot of the time, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So like one of the, for I mean, you know this, but for the people who in your audience who don't, like, one of the hallmarks of Kojima games is that they are very self-aware. And one of the most famous moments of this is in Metal Gear Solid 1, which was this sort of path-breaking game for the PlayStation. Probably one of the most massively popular games of its time. There's a boss fight where you have to put your controller on the ground, and the boss makes it move by using the vibrate function. He changes the TV settings in the quote unquote changes the TV settings so you can't see him during the fight. You have to switch what port your controller's plugged in. All this sort of wacky stuff. And that shows up in Snatcher, however many years earlier, which is kind of interesting because like you see a lot of moments where your electronic sidekick Metal Gear is saying things like, Gilliam, you're in a video game, right? Like you understand you're in a video game and you're being controlled by the person playing it. And then he'll be like, well, yeah, of course. And you'll move on. Yeah. It's very clear that Kojima is doing this.
Yeah. But like you say, I think it feels like, you said it was Snatcher's more playful. It feels like it's more in Snatcher when it does it. It feels like it's more of a joke, I think. Whereas in Metal Gear where it does it, it's kind of trying to reach for something a bit more, I don't know what the word I'm looking for.
It's like it tries to be artsy, right? Or like it tries to like make some sort of big like capital S statement. Whereas I think in Snatcher, it really feels like he's just kind of having fun. Which I mean, there's a charming element to it. It sort of feels like Kojima's story is so interesting because he basically like he kind of went broke and just was completely hopeless and, just full of effort at making these games. And it's all he really wanted to do before he got Metal Gear out. And like, I think he had a number of attempts that didn't work out. And, he basically like before he did Metal Gear, he called his mom and his mom was like, no, you got to keep trying. And Snatcher kind of, I think more so than the Metal Gear Solid games has that element of Kojima to it, where it's just a guy who's clearly absolutely in love with just doing the medium. Like he's just very, very into the medium, very into like the freedom video games are giving him at that point in time. So like, I don't begrudge the Metal Gear Solid games for not being like that. He's in the industry for that long. He's gonna change his approach, but it really does feel like a game that is very much at home in its medium.
Sure. So let's get on to talking a bit about the kind of specifics of Snatcher's world, the kind of backup of it. So this is a post-disaster world. It's set after something kind of vague event called the catastrophe, which is happened after an explosion in 1996 in the game's timeline. And that released a biological weapon called like Lucifer Alpha. And that killed...
Nicely named.
Yeah.
For a fall. Yeah.
That kills like 80% of the population of Europe and Eurasia. Something which I don't know, I don't particularly know. I'm not like an expert on like Japanese media or anything or Japanese culture. I don't know how much you know about that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I just always think it's interesting with Japanese post-disaster fiction. Obviously a lot of post-disaster fiction is like post-nuclear event, and it's always interesting to me that Japan's the only place that's actually like experienced that disaster, which I think quite often lends it something different or extra, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I actually noticed a lot. I was noticing it this time around, and it's not uncommon in Japanese media to see like like when you're. I'm not pulling anything specific to mind at this point, but you think about any of these like futuristic stories, a lot of them, especially if they come from Japan, have the threat of nuclear annihilation kind of pulled off, where it's like, at the beginning, or if you go through the computer files on Jordan, the AI computer that Gillian has access to, it talks about how basically like all the countries did away with their nuclear weapons like well before Lucifer Alpha happened, which is wild because like it takes it off the table in a way. And I don't know, like to my mind, it always strikes me. I think it was I forgot his. Oh, it's the noise artist Merzbow, who's Japanese, said like his theory is that the nuclear bombs were so like the fact that Japan was bombed was so deeply affecting, that it basically scarred the country to the point that like it expresses everything via the subconscious response to those explosions. So once, I don't know how right he is, but like on some level, if that is true, you can understand why it would almost seem either too obvious or too sacred to even couch your disasters that way.
Sure. So this is very obviously a piece of cyberpunk media. Something I wanted to ask you about that is obviously the kind of foundational cyberpunk texts like Neuromancer and Blade Runner and whatever borrowed or expropriated, however you want to term it, a lot of stuff from Japan. Like they were
for sure.
Yeah, and this is obviously like Japan reflecting that interpretation back, but I found it interesting. Like to me, it didn't feel like a particularly Japanese interpretation of cyberpunk in the say something like Akira or Ghost in a Shell. This felt like it felt like a very American vision. It felt like it was, just as those original cyberpunk texts were taking stuff from Japan and kind of sending those back. It felt like it was sending something from America back. It's kind of a strange thing. I don't know how you felt about that.
No, I agree. And there's like when Gillian goes to the sort of black market area called Kojima, definitely, some of the stuff he takes from Metal Gear, where this world apparently exists in the same universe as Metal Gear. As like the engineer makes your little robot pal look like a tiny Metal Gear, and he says like, "Oh, I named him after that crisis that happened in the early, in the last part of the 20th century." So like clearly we're supposed to be in the same continuum, which at the time I'm sure was playful, and now probably creates all sorts of bizarre canon theories by people online. Yeah. Yeah, like you're in Plato's cavern, the black market area, and Gillian says something like, "This doesn't feel like Japan," and that sentiment's kind of echoed a lot in Neo Kobe, which is the fake city that you're in, the sort of like man-made city that takes to the outer islands and makes them one big island. And like, it seems like the idea that like this doesn't really feel like Japan as you would know it is very much at the forefront of what everyone thinks about Neo Kobe, which, I mean, for a game that ostensibly is, going to be set in and in the milieu of futuristic Japan is kind of notable.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, you find a lot of Western influence in a lot of Kojima's games, I think, and he's quite obviously very interested in Western culture, so I guess that accounts for it. And we've already mentioned Blade Runner, and it's like pretty obviously taking a lot of stuff from that. So
for sure,
I guess that kind of accounts for it to an extent.
I mean, I guess, but even Blade Runner kind of appropriates from Japanese culture a lot, right? Like, I mean, there's the kind of I feel like that kind of like stacked one on top of another neon like cityscape. It couldn't really happen without the sort of Asian metropolis, right? Like there's something about that looks so much more like Tokyo or Shanghai than it does New York or Chicago. And like Blade Runner is all about that. And so Snatcher. But you're right. Like it doesn't, for whatever reason, if Neuromancer feels like strangely like American, we could say like American with Japanese characteristics, this just feels like, American with American characteristics, but produced in Japan.
Yeah, just odd, but
yeah, very strange.
Yeah. So yeah, we mentioned the Snatchers. So they are. We don't know exactly where they are at the beginning of the game, I guess, but they're like, we know that they're kind of robot skeletons that are used to replace people.
They look like the Terminators from the James Cameron movies.
Yeah,
like particularly from the James Cameron movies. I guess the later ones too, but yeah, just like the Terminators without skin.
So there you go. It's another thing borrowed from a Western culture.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and yeah, what these Snatchers tend to go after powerful people or like people with influence, and again, we don't really know why. So. Actually, I think before we get on to talking about that some more, I just want to ask, you've already mentioned the little computer that exists in the game that has a lot of background information on it if you care to look through that. It's like an optional thing. You can scroll through and read a lot of stuff about the society and history and stuff like that. This is something which a device that is kind of a unique thing to video games. This kind of, optional thing of looking through stuff, which can be done in various different ways. Famously often done with audio diaries that are left lying around in video game environments or
right.
documents that you find. Also, or, talking to other characters to find out information and so on. Not always as blatant as a kind of just a computer with info listed on it. I just wanted to ask if that's something that you think has some value in it or is effective, either in the case of this specific example or just in games in general.
Yeah, it's funny because I love System Shock 2. It's one of my favorite games, and actually I didn't play it in its time. I played it way, way later, but it still holds up. It's an amazing game, and it really is the game that introduced the idea of the audio diary. I think, I would say, maybe my history is wrong there, but it seems to me that that's the case, or at least popularized it. Yeah. And it's brilliantly used in that instance. But I think as much as I like that, and I like the audio diary conceit, there's something, as you said, the audio diaries are always just hanging around, and it's oh, look, someone recorded themselves saying exactly the thing I wanted to know about, the way the space station was built. It's very artificial, which is fine. I mean, that's kind of the point. But I think there's something to the codex, right? Where, Jordan, or in the Elder Scrolls games where, and I guess the Fallout games too, where there's just massive series of books or various computers or people who have an unimaginable amount of text is written in there. Planescape Torment was an early RPG that had this. The actual game book was longer than a novel. And it's just because you can talk to anyone and they'll tell you anything you want to know about this world. I think that's cool. What I like about that, I think it's clumsy and I think it's clunky, and video games have never really found out the best way of dealing with it. So to me, even this obvious version where it's here's a computer with all the information if you want it, is sort of charming because it sort of acknowledges the fact that no one's come up with a good answer for this. But I like that it kind of presents you with this extremely complex world, and instead of doing the kind of comic book movie trope of being okay, so we're going to spend the first 20 minutes explaining this stuff to you so you know what's going on in the rest of the movie. It kind of just leaves it there. And it's if you want to know more about this, feel free. But, some people are just going to want to play the shooty parts. Some people are just going to solve the mystery. Some people are going to want to know the lore. It's there if you want to learn about it. It's not if you don't. And I think there's some real value in an entertainment media that's able to take its the kind of larger socio-political bits and have them in there, but only for the people who want them.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the specific of the stuff that's on the computer, going back to talking about ways in which this game is surprisingly relevant, there's a lot of stuff in there about immigration and response to immigration, which I couldn't quite work out the game's position on that, whether it was being...
Yeah, it's a little weird. It almost explicitly plays both sides, where it's people came in and it was fine, and then it's immigration increased and crime went up.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Yeah, so it says, so it talks about a lot of immigrants coming, and then there being an increased, it says, asset distribution gap between the rich and the poor. And it says that this contributed to the social and ethnic splintering of the populace, who ended up with a North rich and a poor South. But yeah, it's not quite clear whether it's blaming immigrants for that, or kind of suggesting that immigrants are an exploited class that's allowed them to create a rich North.
It's unclear. I mean, the North is not portrayed well. I mean, Gibson, the cop that you start the game out by examining why he was killed, and that sort of leads you down the rabbit hole. But I mean, Gibson doesn't seem like a particularly noble man. He's all right, especially early on, he's fine. But he eats endangered species and fills his house with antiques and just kind of exists as in this dangerous role while ignoring his daughter. And if you read did you actually, I just wanted to ask, because I out of curiosity, did you end up reading the stuff on Jordan?
Yeah, but it's a little while ago that I played it now, and I have a terrible,
yeah.
memory. So yeah, I did read it, but I've probably forgotten.
No, it was more out of curiosity, because like for me that was a weirdly immersive part of the game. Just like learning about that world. It reminded me a lot of like when I was a kid and learning about, I don't know, like, any various RPG I was playing and being like, oh, so this was the king then, and what happened after that?
So if I wasn't playing this for the podcast, I don't know if I would have read it, because I don't know. I think I tend to like it in games when that kind of extra stuff is something that you kind of absorb as like a more vague sense, if you know what I mean. Like if the
that's certainly more elegant.
Yeah. But I don't know. But then also in terms of, I think it's just quite unique in terms of having in a video game having a bit of text talking about the kind of politics of immigration and kind of so that if I'd seen that, then that might have interested me enough to read it as well, I think.
I mean, the interesting thing I think about the reason I brought up Jordan was because there's a little bit in there on witch hunts and the fact that when the Snatchers first came around, the North used it as an excuse to go after people in the South, and they basically killed a lot of people they just didn't very much like, and they named it after the Salem witch trials, and then they realized, like, oh, actually, the Snatchers are all getting VIPs. And then the entry ends with something like, and then all the witch hunts abruptly stopped for some reason. So there's clearly a tongue-in-cheek quality to the treatment of the North, but you're right, it's split. But sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that example that you've given is one where you feel like it's very much like on the side of immigrants. It's like, oh, something bad happened, so everybody obviously blamed poor immigrants and like started killing them, and they had nothing to do with it. And this is what happens. This is what happens a lot now. Like when there are difficulties, like people blame poor immigrants instead of like billionaires or whatever.
Yeah, but then also it says like there's a number of times where it pulls the kind of like really pernicious conservative move where it says like, but crime is really bad in the South and it's real dangerous down there, and that's where all the crime is. So but then it also is like super careful when it's talking about people without IDs or people who like erase their identity. And they're like, yeah, like those folks, definitely, they're able to, they're smart and they're capable and they're able to like remove their ID. They're not like the homeless who, due to systemic, cruelty and like actions against them, have lost the have had the basic, rights of like survival taken away from them. And it's like, that's really woke about homelessness, but it's like it's just in a weird paragraph about how crummy the South is. It's a strange moment, but like, just to get this thought off my mind, a lot of that Codex stuff, it really feels like, and this is true. This is apparently true of Kojima now. Like a lot of it feels like that Kojima sense where he has like 800 ideas and he wants to get them all in there in part of the game. And, once he's powerful enough in at the height of his powers in like Metal Gear Solid 5, he's, calling PAs at 2 a.m. and saying, get me multiplayer on this game. And they have no idea how to do it, but they are, the company says do it anyway. In 88, I doubt he was like that. So I think a lot of this seems like he wanted Snatcher to be a lot bigger. Like some of this stuff seems like plot lines or side quests or something like that just couldn't be there, so they kind of written about on the side. They have like a very unique quality that way.
I think that's a good point actually, because again, for people who don't know, one of the Kojima games tend to be very popular and tend to be well received, but when they are criticized, one of the things that people often say is like, this guy needs an editor, and I think you're right in saying he wouldn't have had the kind of power that he did later to do like hour-long cutscenes and just have that be a thing that's okay. So that makes
This
sense.
would be a lot less elegant of a game if Kojima 2018 made it. Like, it might have been cool, and I'm sure I would play it and enjoy it, but like, there's a kind of like leanness to it now that I admire that would not be there.
So let's get on to the snatchers and the idea of body snatching. Obviously, the most obvious kind of precursor to that is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and this is a common thing, like the body snatching story. It's often in the past been read as like fear of communism, socialism. Do you have any idea or sense of what it might be about in this game? We've already mentioned the immigration stuff. I don't know if that's something. If Japan is often seen as a very kind of isolationist country, so I just wondered if you had any thoughts on what might be going on there.
Yeah, I was definitely trying to puzzle that out too, because whenever you see like, these people are being replaced and you can't tell, it's always a good tell that there's going to be like a sort of like fear of the other plot line going on.
Yeah.
But I think honestly, like in this game, it seems that it really seems like, and this is what threw me off for a long time about Snatcher. There's no clear bad actor for most of the game. Like even in the way that like the Snatchers kind of appear out of nowhere. Like it's like Lucifer Alpha happened, and then we all kind of figured out Lucifer Alpha stopped being deadly after 6 months, and then we all kind of chilled out for a while, and then we found the Snatchers, and then Snatchers started killing people and stealing their skin and stuff, and it's like, wow, that's it almost is like the fear of the other is the fear of just like technological displacement or catastrophe or something. It almost feels like Faded in a very sort of like Persona kind of way, like those games where you just kind of wander into the game in the midst of an apocalypse. I didn't pick up, like I guess in some ways probably it's a fear of Russians and sort of like a post Cold War thing, which I mean is very very of the moment, I suppose. Fear of Russians.
Yeah.
But I mean, since Lucifer Alpha came from Russia, since Russia took most of the punishment up there, since the Snatchers are, if I'm remembering totally correctly, tied back to Russia, like that all speaks to like probably a fear, like a post Cold War thing. I don't know though. It feels to me like it's less politically minded and more existentially minded.
I think that's fair enough. I mean, it is definitely quite kind of vague and more hard to pin down, I think, than in other examples of like this device, which is like, that's the reason I asked you the question, is because I genuinely couldn't kind of pin down like who was meant to be like the other in this case, as you say.
I think that's intentional. Yeah, there's these moments where Gillian will talk to his wife on the phone, and that's an interesting relationship because he and his wife split up because they both have the same amnesia, and this is one of the times where like I think we put up with a lot of bad from Kojima because the good is like genuinely sort of like interesting in a novelistic way. And this is one of Kojima's really good things where he's like, yeah, they were married and they both have exactly the same amnesia. So they try to make it as a couple, but like, since being a couple is generally prefaced on having memories in common with each other and having sort of a built shared relationship, they like both really care about each other, but can't have a marriage. Like it just doesn't work. I thought that was kind of an interesting touch, but he'll have conversations with Jamie, his wife, who's sort of estranged wife, and say, just watch out for the Snatchers, Jamie. And she'll be like, oh, those are just a myth. Like the way that like everyday people don't seem to care about the Snatchers, but the Junkers are like almost constantly being lethally attacked by them is just a strange, like it's almost surreal. Like the game has this surreal quality. The threat does seem like very out there.
Well, I mean, the idea of kind of the authorities or like police caring about ordinary people would certainly tie into a Cold War thing, I think. I mean, there's this, I can't remember, like there's this, I can't remember where I've heard it or read it or whatever, but I'm sure there was some study about the Cold War with like both sides massively overestimated like the power and influence of the other, like during the Cold War. So the idea that the authorities would kind of be obsessed and see this threat everywhere is kind of ties into that, I guess. But
yeah, for sure.
So being as you've already mentioned Russia, so as you suggested, the revelation we get is the Snatchers. It's basically all about Russia. So these are evolved life forms that were created in the depths of the Kremlin. And as we go through the game, there's various clues about Russia. The Snatchers have Russia memorabilia and stuff like that.
They're very susceptible to sunburn, like Russians are.
Sure.
I don't know if that's a thing about Russians or not.
Yeah. The whole idea is that these were created as a plot to, as communism was facing extinction, these were created as a plot to like replace the leaders of their enemies and control their politics and economy. Like control the world's leaders and therefore control the thought of the world. And they're meant to be all over the place. So one of them says, we have comrades throughout the city, more than you can imagine. Right. I thought that was very interesting, this idea of Russia replacing leaders with puppets in terms of the context of some of the, what I would call hysteria about Russia now. Particularly... Well,
and I mean, because actually that's a really good thought. I should let you finish that. But like I was going to say, like, also given that what like America was doing in the sort of like Marshall Plan style attacking of communism was generally putting American puppets in place in communist states. Like that was basically its entire political program in South America and Central America. So it's kind of interesting that, you wouldn't say the Americans are doing it. You'd say, oh, the Russians are doing it. When it's like, actually, like more accurately, that was the other side that was more interested in that.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's a certain like hysteria about Russia, particularly in the US. I think that's also there in the UK a bit now. Thinking about accusations around Donald Trump and the things that have come out of that.
Sure, and people are saying that Corbyn's compromised now, right? I should make it clear at this point. I don't. The Russia stuff doesn't do anything for me. I don't buy into it at all. No, which actually is kind of an unpopular opinion in the U.S. But I feel like everyone who is bad now in someone's eyes is now compromised by the Russians. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. So that's why it's something I wanted to ask you about. Obviously, someone who's experiencing there in America. So there's this, as I say, this very kind of strange obsession with Russia. And I just want to say before, I'm not saying that I would not say that the prospect of Russia trying to interfere in elections is not something that wouldn't need to be investigated, or that Russia is good, or like obviously Putin is like horrible. I
think there's plenty of things that Russia probably did, and like I think there's money from oligarchs that is propping up Trump. I mean I think that's probably certainly true. Like it would be no surprise if Russian oligarchs were interested in installing a more reactionary government in America. That would make total sense.
Yes, absolutely. But it's kind of seems to become something. As we say, it seems to become like a hysteria. Would you say it's got like? Would it be too much to call it like a second like Red Scare, or maybe not quite that far? I don't know.
Well, it's such a weird Red Scare, right? Because like it. I think like some of like the resistance quote unquote people have taken it that way, where like, Putin's ex-KGB and like they'll say Trump's a communist and stuff. But I think people by and large understand that Trump is not a communist. Like I think people by and large understand the difference between words and their definitions. I guess like it's become this weird. It's not so much a Red Scare as it is like just an easy explanation for people that don't want to say like they don't want to admit that politicians are often just bad people, right? Like Lindsey Graham, for instance, is a senator in America. I don't know how familiar his name is outside of America, but he's a very conservative senator. Before the election, he was part of this coalition of conservatives that were called Never Trumpers, right? The Never Trumpers said, this is the end of the party if he joins, and I will stand up. And of course they didn't, right? Like everyone saw that coming from a mile away.
Sure.
But Lindsey Graham didn't. And now Lindsey Graham is like basically with the whole the big controversy right now is this judge appointment to the Supreme Court of Donald Trump's appointee is almost certainly a serial sexual abuser, as we've sort of uncovered over the past couple of weeks, and he'll almost certainly still get confirmed. And Lindsey Graham has become like just frothing at the mouth crazy about this. Like just extremely into getting Kavanaugh, the person who's maybe getting appointed. And I can't tell you how many replies in like news threads I've accidentally seen by opening them in full Twitter that just say like, he's in Russia's pocket. Mueller, who's the lead investigator, like, investigate Lindsey Graham. Like, Lindsey Graham is a Russian. Like, it's just easier to say like he's just like not a good person. Like, he's kind of a coward and spineless and has really cruel politics. I think that's just as easy to say than like, oh, some Russian oligarchs have compromat on him, which is why he's being a huge conservative jerk.
So I've seen, you mentioned seeing people like blaming that on Russia. I've also seen stuff like I've seen people blaming school shootings on Russia, saying that it's kind of their
I've seen
funding.
Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was at one point like one of the people, Eric Garland suggested that was actually fomented by Russia. That Ferguson was a Russia thing. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, obviously you get like, these are kind of, I guess, more extreme examples, but also I've seen, for example, Glenn Greenwald, the journalist, being accused of being a Russian agent because I think it's a guy called David Frum. I don't know if you know him.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So I obviously am a step removed from like American kind of political culture, but I've picked up enough through Twitter to kind of, I've kind of surmised that he's a massive dickhead, but I don't really.
Yeah, no one likes David Frum. Yeah.
But
absolutely,
he's ostensibly, what people consider, in quote marks, a serious journalist. I mean, he's not like. Well, he is a crank, but he's not just some random person. What I'm saying is, this isn't just some random person blaming.
Yeah, intellectual conservatives. Like, people want George Will or like Buckley or whatever, William F. Buckley. Like, people just demand this sort of fantasy of like conservatives who, like, even though we didn't agree with them, by God, they had a great argument or something like that, right? And like Frum's just the newest iteration of that attempt. I think it's just weird though, because like anymore. And this is actually what I think is kind of charming about Snatcher, or interesting even, like politically interesting about Snatcher, is like, it seems like the Russia hysteria in America is just basically any time someone points out a way that America isn't very good. Like we're doing more and more, to our credit. When I was a kid, no one would really point out that America was bad, and now people are just doing it all the time. So, we're making progress. But whenever anyone points out and says like, actually, you know what, like, yes, of course, like, things are bad under Trump, but, in 1991, Rodney King and the LA riots happened, and things have been bad for people of color forever. It seems like people just want to then say, a certain group of people just want to then say, yeah, well, we were doing a lot better until the Russians came along and made us bad again. Like the sort of like narrative of American goodness is just, that's the last line of defense, where like we have to be the protagonists of history, and the only reason we're not is because Russia stumbled in at the last minute and ruined everything.
I think Russia, and like more broadly sort of communism, and the communism that was in Russia, is a very useful device for people. Like, I mean, I talk a lot about obviously anti-utopianism as well as utopianism, and
this would be one of those, I suppose.
Yeah, and one of the things that we have kind of like new fascisms emerging, but we also have new kind of revitalized leftist movements and people talking more about socialism and communism, and Russia becomes a very useful device in that scenario for anti-utopians and establishment to go, gulags, like they so that's
Russia and Venezuela. Those are their favorite ones.
Yeah. So basically what I'm saying is, whenever an actual political discussion starts to take place, as in terms of not politics, in terms of like the minutiae of electoral politics, but like like politics, ideology, like completely different ways of living. That's
what
a very
you believe.
useful way. Russia or communism becomes a very useful kind of bogeyman to try and like shut that down, I guess. Which
absolutely. Well, I mean, what's interesting about Snatcher then is like they're the ghosts of an ideology, right? Like there's not really a Russia left.
No, it's been destroyed. Like
like all of your like they're vague about it, but basically all of Central and Eastern Europe is like not only uninhabited, but there was the Third World War was fought because people wanted to take it over. And I think like the sort of like remaining Russians wanted to take it over, and then it didn't work, and now that whole area is just basically a no man's land. It's a DMZ, I guess, kept up somehow by peacekeeping forces. I have no idea. It's not very well thought out. But I mean, there are Russians left, but like by and large, they've lost 80% of their population, and they're just like a shell of themselves. So like the Snatchers are there trying to like achieve power for their communist overlords, but there aren't any overlords left. It's just like the machines running without a brain, which I think is kind of powerful in a certain way to think like, the things we put into motion in the service of our ideology stay in motion even after our ideologies are gone.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's definitely, it's kind of like feels like a haunting of like something that's dead. It's like because the Snatchers are kind of, the idea is that they're kind of carrying this on, like they've been created for a purpose to carry out this ideology by an authority, but that's now gone, and they're kind of autonomously just following that through like by themselves. So yeah, it's kind of a strange idea.
Yeah, and it speaks to the whole premise of understanding them, which is like the Junkers know certain things about the Snatchers, and the Snatchers know things about the Junkers, and like it is. I mean, do you know the game? It just came out. Do you know the game Spy Party? Have you seen that?
Yeah, that's the one where there's you have to like. It's like multiplayer thing.
And like one person plays the spy and one person plays a sniper who's going to shoot the spy, basically, and like you have to pick out who's at the party. So your job as the sniper is to find the spy, but your job as the spy is to like try and remain inconspicuous. And you sort of have that relationship with the Snatcher and the Junker, where it's like we all know, both of us know we're out there. We just have to keep this kind of tete-a-tete up where neither of us tips our hand enough so that I know, that you know that I know, and that I know that you know. That would be the bad situation. So we have to keep everything kind of vague and strange. So all the information about the Snatchers are like, oh, they have a little weak point on their head, or their skin is artificial. It comes in like trickles. It's fascinating because it's exactly like that kind of that rumor mill of dead technology that was such a thing before, instant internet debunkings and things like that back in the 80s and 90s.
Oh, yeah, sure. Before we move on, I wanted to ask you one more thing about the kind of Russia as a way to like avoid politics, which is to talk about the kind of how Russia's been used for like the Democratic Party, which to me, externally, appears to primarily be used as an excuse to accept responsibility for losing to Trump and its own failings.
Yeah,
is that
it's
fair?
Pretty rough. I wish they'd stop talking about it.
Because the narrative, right, is still that the reason that Trump won the election is because Russia rigged it. There's been no kind of from the Democratic Party institution. There's been no kind of soul searching on their own kind of ideological bankruptcy and
absolutely not. Like and in fact, even less than that, where like the main people, like the heads of the party, particularly like Nancy Pelosi, who's the sort of like the House majority figure or minority figure at this point, but she's basically like well, no, not anymore. Chuck Schumer's that, but for a while she was basically the party whip. She basically had a whole thing that went viral because she was like, "Yeah, you look like we're a party of capitalists. Like we like capitalism in this party," and just like totally misread the room. And there's Chuck Schumer has said a million things about like, well, when we get back into power, we'll reinstate norms instead of doing what every Democrat or leftist wants them to do, which is play exactly as hard as the Republicans do in getting their horrifying regressive policies. And like, they just want to keep playing fair and saying like, America was already great, let's go back to that. It's basically like, if you look at UK politics and you see like, okay, there's Labour, there are the Tories, and then there are the Lib Dems, the sort of like completely flaccid centrist party. Basically, we don't have Labour. We just have the Tories and the Lib Dems. And you just sort of are stuck with the Lib Dems being like, well, it's not perfect, but it follows the rules.
Well, we've kind of got that like within Labour as well. That's kind of the...
Oh, yeah, right, Labour, yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's kind of the I mean, it's basically all the Labour members and the leadership at the moment, but then, like, yeah, a lot of the... It's similar in a sense in that a lot of the institutions of the Labour Party and a lot of the actual MPs are still like the Democrats, basically. Like, they are fundamentally happy with the way things were before. This is actually a lot of the problems that they've had in terms of fighting against Brexit as well, where their idea is like, the idea in the first place was we need to not have Brexit because it would make things bad. So we just need to keep things as they are, like ignoring the fact that things were bad for a lot of people. And that's still the argument that some people are making, like we need to go back to the way things were, which is like, it's not really a very good motivating argument for lots of people.
It just creates, and I mean, like, this is absolutely the reason Russia's used in casual arguments, the same reason Democrats use Russia, insofar as like, you get this kind of like political cosplay or political like, I don't even know, like almost a fandom where all of a sudden like George W. Bush says like Trump is definitely bad, and every Democrat's like, don't you remember when we had class in the White House? And then immediately George W. Bush is like calling his powerful friends and saying, be sure to vote for Kavanaugh. And like, you can't say anything about that. You've totally been had. So all you could say is Russia made Kavanaugh happen. And it's the same thing with like Blairites, right? Where like you can say like, well, things were better back then. And then someone's like, well, what about the fires at Grenfell? Like, that is something you had a part in. Yeah. And it's like, don't you guys remember when the US and the UK were friends and went to Iraq together? Like, it's just this weird politics of sentiment that has, it not only has no content, it falls apart at every possible turn.
Yeah, absolutely. As much as I enjoy bashing liberals,
we should probably,
things. But yeah, let's move on. So, the other thing I wanted to talk about was kind of some of the gender relations of the game, and
I thought about that too.
Yeah, some toxic masculinity, I think would be fair to say. So this is. How
about the smell command that you can?
Oh man, yeah.
That when talking to women, you can choose to smell them. Yeah. That was a little crazy. That was a little rough.
Yeah, so you can basically hit on every woman in the game. Obviously, none of the men. I think some of them are spent
super straight.
Yeah, despite some of them being very young as well, and your character's meant to be like middle-aged, I guess.
Do you think they changed some of that in localization? Like when they said, "Don't get any ideas, Gillian. She's only 18." I thought in my mind I was like, I bet before localization that was 16.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I was going to say, do you think that kind of? So I mean, a lot of people who would look down on video games, I think, would think of that as a video game thing, which I don't think
it is
entirely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. This is something that Kojima does a lot though as well. So yeah, I was going to ask you: is this like, do you see this as like a Kojima thing or a video game?
It's such a Kojima thing. Oh, absolutely. Like the real Kojima thing is Mika, the person at the office who's ostensibly like quite a powerful figure in the Junkers. Like she says she's the administrative assistant, but she basically like runs the entire administration that isn't, just like ops and stuff, right? But she is just kind of like a wilting rose in front of Gillian, who just like constantly flirts with her with no consequences. And like that's very Kojima. I think some of the other stuff it's before Kojima kind of got crafty about hiding this part of his work, where like, in Metal Gear Solid, was it 5 when Quiet showed up? I can't remember. I don't know
Yeah.
if you've played them. Yeah. So like Quiet is like a very scantily clad sniper who can't speak, and of course everyone was like, oh, you introduced a woman who can't have speaking lines who only wears a bikini, and Kojima was like, well, she breathes through her skin, so she has to have it exposed. That's the reason for it. Like, maybe read some of the canon before you get upset.
Yeah.
Like, this doesn't even have that veneer.
Yeah. I think that like this aspect is still, like you say, perhaps better hidden. Like, I still think you find it in video games a lot. Like now, there's a bit like at the end, 3 of the women like show up, and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like a teenager sexual fantasy. Like they all, they're basically like his wife's there with 2 other women who are kind of all hinting that like they're into it. Like one of them says,
Right.
our relationship has gone beyond just being friends. So I mean, so you've got these 3 women like kind of stating their love and or sexual desire for him in front of each other without any kind
I think you can reverse it. I think you could say sexual desire and or love. Like, I think the sexual desire is definitely on the surface more. Like, it's so weird because like it's so shoehorned in. It really speaks to like an older era of gaming, or maybe I mean, it might just speak to the genre of the visual novel, which does this more often because like visual novels are often dating sims. But like, I don't think something like Silver Case, or I'm trying to think of other good like crime visual novels, but Silver Case is a good example. Like, I don't think there's a lot of relationship options in that, and if there are, they're probably a little more nuanced than, like they're. A good example. So Isabella, the daughter of Gibson, who's killed, it's like when you meet her, there's an option in your actions called do something when you talk to any woman, which is a truly cursed option. And generally it's console, wipe her tears away, and persuade. And if you persuade, you ask them out on a date pretty much. And Isabella's response to you if you ask her out on a date when she like just found out her dad died is, "Are you kidding me?" Which, like, a good response, but you still can talk to her. You basically can sexually harass these women all you want, and they just kind of hang around. Like, you're leering at them and touching them, and basically they just go, "Oh, Gillian." Yeah. It's very uncomfortable. Like, it's shoehorned in for no reason. You could take that whole element out and lose literally nothing from Snatcher.
Yeah. Although I will say, though it is particularly bad in this game, I don't think that's necessarily unique. Well, what I don't think is unique to video games is we quite often have visions of the future, like utopian or dystopian, where there's a great deal of technological advancement, but somehow this doesn't seem to have changed. Like the power of women or gender relations or whatever you'd want to call it, despite the fact
it's like the...
Sorry,
go ahead, sorry.
No, go on.
Oh, it's like the Demolition Man problem, right? Where like... have you seen Demolition Man recently?
Oh, not recently, but I've seen it quite a few times. So.
Yeah, it was like the first R-rated movie I ever saw. That and Judge Dredd, so it sticks in my mind. But the end of the sex in Demolition Man is always my most instructive element of this, where they have to have virtual sex because they're so terrified of sexually transmitted diseases. And that's like it seems like because it's introduced by the female lead, like it's very much is that Sandra Bullock? Yeah, I guess. It seems like very much a female solution. Like, oh, this is safe, but it's just not as good. And then at the end of the movie, Sylvester Stallone kisses her, which is like extraordinarily taboo in their society. And she totally melts and becomes extremely subservient. And it's basically like, oh, this technological advancement, we all know what women really want. Yeah. Like, that's always undergirding this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. The other thing I want to talk about on this subject is Elijah Modner, who is kind of the bad guy behind this all. He's the one who kind of mobilized the Snatchers, and he's kind of like an incel, I suppose you would say now, because he's
that's fair.
He's obsessed with Jamie, who is Gillian's wife. We've already mentioned kind of estranged wife, and he says that, like, you know, he's creepily talking about her, like explaining his motivations about how he always wanted to be near her all the time. And I think there's actually a phrase in there where he says this whole thing about the catastrophe that killed all these people and all the Snatcher stuff. He says Jamie's beauty is the cause of it all. And that's basically like the ideology of incels, right? The idea that a woman withholding sex from a man is the cause of civilization's problems.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, like, and it's even like, there's even an element of like, it's in a world where catastrophe seems to be totally random and people have even given up trying to explain what happened, right? It always still if you dig deep enough, a woman did it.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, well, who knows where Lucifer Prime came from? We don't have to worry about it, It's fine. Like, it happened and it's really upsetting, but we'll have our biologists think about it a little more. Like, let's just move on as a society. And then, like, one brave detective finds out that it was his wife's fault.
Yeah.
that kind of sucks.
Yeah. And the weird thing is, I don't know, there's a suggestion that the game maybe thinks you should sympathize with this motivation.
Well, yeah,
because
that's a very very Kojima thing where, like, I mean, you look at like Liquid Snake or like the best version of this, weirdly, and he never really follows up on it in the right way, but the best version of this is in Metal Gear Solid 3 where the bad guy is the original boss and it's a woman. And she's like a super compelling villain. Like, she's a great villain. Like, she's super fun and super interesting. As I remember, it's been a while, so maybe it's much worse than I
think.
That's
definitely his best, possibly his only good female character, I think.
It might be. I mean, I guess people liked Rose, but I don't know. Like, it didn't really do much.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think like that's certainly fair. There aren't any contenders in Snatcher for sure. But it was cool. Like, it was cool to think about, like, oh, you know, like, there's this relationship here and it's a mentor relationship and, you know, there's betrayal that way, but it doesn't have to do with her being a woman, but she's still a female character. Like, that was cool. But he does that with all of his characters. It's not just her. Like, Liquid Snake is the same way, and Big Boss, and all these characters are like, they're evil because something happened, and they're just like people making good decisions that the decisions end up being evil, you know, or they end up being misguided. Like, I think that's very true of all of his characters. It's just that Elijah is a much harder sell to tell us he's good.
Yeah, because, I mean, some of those characters, I mean, they've at least had, I mean, I think, like, Psycho Mantis already mentioned, I think, like, when he was a kid, like, his whole village was murdered or burned down or something like that, whereas Elijah Modner just didn't get to have sex with a woman that he wanted to have sex with, so it's kind of a bit more hard to sympathize with that, I think.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's like, it's just like, why would anyone, like, if you put it in real world terms, if you found out that, like, on the level of probably billions of people had died because this guy was, like, pretty frustrated about sex. I mean, I can't even imagine the furthest of MRA being like, yeah, that's the woman's fault there. It's like, you shouldn't have blown up that lab.
I'm sure they would manage to blame it.
I mean, yeah, I just said that out loud and I was like, well, yeah, I mean, it's always women's fault. Yeah. That's true.
Yeah. Well, now
I mean, I think, like, this is the weird conflict in this game, right? Where there's so much that's good about it. Like, I posted a thing from, like, I'll see if I can find it, like, the actual language, because I really liked what it said. Like, it was, oh yeah, there was a whole discussion. Did you get to the whole discussion in Outer Heaven where, like, I forget what you had to talk about to see it, but, like, Gillian talks with Metal Gear about how like video games were used as an excuse by people who were, like, mad about violence and they were wrong and those senators were voted out of office. It's when you, like, look at the characters in the club and one of them's from Lethal Enforcers.
Oh, okay.
So they have a number of stuff like that, but the one was like, here it is. It's from the Jordan. So it says it's talking about the city, and it's talking about the slums. So we can, you know, we'll go right back around. It's talking about the South. And it says, while government proposals to remedy the situation have been discussed for a number of years, debate over implementation methods, civil rights, and the like has prevented any actual progress from being made. Approximately 30% of the city's total area is officially recognized as falling outside of the municipal data administration districts, and at least another 10% is believed to be similarly beyond government control, though not yet designated as such. And it's just this perfect distillation of exactly what the 21st century is going to be, where, like, disaster is going to happen and governments will acknowledge the disaster and do nothing to fix it. And it's very, very cogent. And, I posted this and someone was like, well, of course it's Cyberpunk. Like, Cyberpunk always is cogent that way. But that's not true. Like, some Cyberpunk doesn't get it. Some Cyberpunk is just like, this is cool neon or whatever. Like, this definitely understands how things would devolve in that kind of situation. It's extremely smart that way. And then it has all these dumb notes in there that you're just like, why is this in here? What is going on?
Yeah, I was going to kind of search for a nice way of rounding this all up, but I think that was quite nice. It is kind of indicative of Kojima, I think. Often some very interesting and provoking stuff mixed in with some really terrible regressive things as well. So
yeah, for sure.
But yeah, thank you very much for coming on. It's been fun talking to you.
No, thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Where can people go to find your podcast and so forth if they would like to?
I'm on iTunes, I thought I was on Google Play, but I guess that's maybe not true. I'm on most podcast services though, as just No Cartridge or No Cartridge Audio. You can find me there, spelled exactly how you'd think. No fancy spellings. It's also at no-cartridge.net. From there you can get to the Patreon and most of the content. But if you want, I do like readings of Marx and stuff like that on the Patreon sometimes. It's kind of an interesting series of bonus content. That's just patreon.com/Hagelbon. But other than that, no, that's it. And then you can go to my Twitter. Twitter's Hagelbon, Hegelbon. And I kind of spend way too much time on there.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks again.
Thank you, Paul.
So that is the end of my conversation with Trevor. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, if you've got any questions about stuff coming in the episodes or feedback or anything else, then you can get in touch via email at utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com. You can get in touch on Twitter at Utopian Horizons and on Facebook at facebook.com/utopianhorizons. I'm not quite sure when the next episode is going to be released. I originally had planned to have something ready to go like a week after this one, but that had to get delayed for reasons that can't be helped. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to sort of. I'm going to try and get something else ready as soon as I can, but I'm not sure exactly what that'll be. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, if you're looking for more to listen to, there are extra bonus episodes that you can get on via the Patreon at patreon.com/Utopian Horizons. So I'd appreciate it if you could check that out and you can see what's available on there. In fact, I'm guessing some of you are probably coming to listen to this for the first time from Trevor's podcast, No Cartridge. So also there's a whole back catalogue of stuff. There's if you're into video stuff, there's an episode on BioShock Infinite, and there's all kinds of books and films and interesting things that I've already done. So have a look back through and see if there's anything there that takes your fancy. Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed it, please consider recommending it to someone you think might like it, or tweeting about it, or giving me a review or whatever. That would be cool. I'll be back as soon as I can. Cheers. Bye.